We have had a request to look at some answers to topic theme 4F for Christianity. So theme 4F is entitled Religious Identity Through Responses to Poverty and Injustice, but we know it as Liberation Theology, which is what this theme is all about. Please note this phrasing here, so the basis, political, ethical and religious of South American liberation theology. So you could have a quite general part A that asks you to explain the political, ethical and religious basis of liberation theology. They could narrow it down and just ask you to focus on one, which I think would be quite hard, or two. Additionally, you could have a question referring to one of these liberation theologians, so either Gutierrez or Boff, so that's another possibility. Or the question could be, how does the Roman Catholic Church respond? So if you revise this unit, which you should do, you need to be aware of sort of those 4 or 5 options. When it comes to part B, there are 2 themes that they have suggested. I want to remind you that the evaluation can come from anywhere in the course. So it's likely, not definitely, likely to be whether one of these bases is more important than the other. So is politics more important to liberation theology than religion, for example? And I think it would be a politics/religion contrast, if I'm being honest. I don't think it would be ethical down here. And then the second one is whether liberation theology has offered a cultural challenge to the Roman Catholic Church. If we look at the sample assessment materials, so to remind you, I've got these from the EDUCAS website. So I've got EDUCAS A-Level Religious Studies. It takes you to this page here. Then you scroll down and there's this grey bar that's got specification and SAMS. So I've clicked on that, which then gives me this option here, A-Level Religious Studies SAMS. Litship students, there's also a link to this on our Twitter page as well. So that takes us to this sample assessment material. And these were the exam papers that were sent out to teachers or freely available on the website before we started teaching the course. So there are example papers that we have been through, and you can see that there is a very general question here. Explain the basis of and the reasons for the development of South American liberation theology. And the part B is the response to liberation theology was mainly positive. And if you keep scrolling, the mark scheme to that question is going to be here. So there's mark schemes for World Council of Churches, Ecumenical Movement, and here's the one that we're looking at. So this sample paper is really worth looking at, particularly for this part B question, which is quite specific and quite tricky. So I would advise you to perhaps have a go at thinking about the arguments you're going to use and coming up with a thesis statement. But we're now going to go to the question that I have chosen, which is explain the basis, political, ethical and religious of South American liberation theology with reference to Gutierrez. So slightly more specific than the question on the sample paper. So you've got a range of things to look at. As always, I'm going to talk you through how I am showing the skills that the examiner is looking for. And in a part A, that's good use of religious language, evidence, sources of wisdom, scholars, schools of thought. I don't really have schools of thought here. And if I'm being honest, my scholar is just Gutierrez because he is named up here and then linking back to the question. So I have an introductory paragraph, and every time I show you these videos, I do say that lots of teachers will say skip introductions, and they could be right. There is no one way to get a grade A star. I use introductions as a way of calming me down and making me really focus on what the question is asking. Because I try to echo the wording here in my introduction. So the question is, explain the basis, political, ethical and religious, of South American liberation theology with reference to Gustavo Gutierrez. So I start with his name to echo there. Sometimes known as the father of liberation theology. Liberation theology is there. He was the first to use the phrase liberation theology, echoing the question, and he outlined the political, ethical and religious basis of liberation theology. That could possibly be improved if I put the word South American in there as well. You will then notice that I then give a paragraph to each one of these to make sure that I answer the question. So, liberation theology has a political basis, is my first paragraph. Liberation theology has an ethical basis, is my second paragraph. And liberation theology has a religious basis. And so that way I have addressed each part of the answer, so I'm more likely to get into the top band. You have 20 minutes to type this answer. As always, I sit and type these up under exam conditions. I type them up in 20 minutes. You will have 20 minutes of writing time. And so these are always about 100 words too long. And so that is worth bearing in mind, that you cannot do this exactly in exam conditions. But I think it's good for you to have a rich source of material. So let's start with paragraph 1, which is about the political basis of liberation theology. And first of all, although I only really have one scholar, I just want to stress that I refer to that scholar over and over again. So I am not talking about liberation theology generally. I'm talking about Gutierrez's ideas about liberation theology. I'm sure his name appears in there more often. So, liberation theology has a political basis because to tackle poverty, you need to tackle society, and there needs to be a challenge of the status quo and a new way forming. And so Gutierrez identifies, as we did in lessons, that much of the poverty in Latin America, it may have been better if I'd have said South America, is linked with the way that people have been treated in the past by colonial powers and also by North America today. And so there has to be a political response to that, a change of the system, which at the moment is driven by capitalism and a need for cheap goods and labour. And Gutierrez says that is keeping people in Latin America or South America poor, and so that needs to change. And that led Gutierrez to be supportive of communist revolutions in Latin America and figures like Castro. He doesn't support their violence, or didn't support their violence, but he did support their aim to overthrow capitalism, which would count as a key term, and to oppose North American interests. So that is paragraph 1. That's the politics. Then Gutierrez says that there is an ethical basis to liberation theology, because at its most basic, poverty is just wrong. And so there is a challenge to Christians to respond to poverty because it is an evil, it is wrong, a sort of a key term there, not a particularly impressive one. And Gutierrez identifies 3 types of poverty. So there's material, voluntary and spiritual. And material poverty is the lack of what you need to meet your basic human needs and inadequate access to resources like education and healthcare. And Gutierrez says this is an evil and it should cause a problem for the conscience of every Christian because it is an ethical issue. So I'm reminding you this is about ethics and linking back to the question. And so Christians can then make an ethical choice to live in what he calls voluntary poverty. So that is to learn to love the poor like like Jesus did, and show some kind of solidarity with the poor. But it is not about loving poverty, but loving the poor. And then a nice comparison is made with the kenotic model or kenosis model of the incarnation. If you think back to theme 1, that's the model where Jesus empties himself of divine properties to become human. And in a similar fashion, Christians should be willing to empty themselves of their wealth so that they can show solidarity with the poor. And core to Gutierrez's ideas about liberation theology is that it must be people treating each other as equals. So it isn't, those that are in power, patronising and kneeling down to help the poor, but they live together. And Gutierrez was key in setting up base camps in villages where Christians would live in solidarity. He calls it loving solidarity with the poor. So not just dropping in and out to help when they feel like it, but then going back to their previous rich lives, but living together and tackling poverty together. And there is a nice little quote from Gutierrez that true love exists among equals. So if you want to help poverty, you don't do it as an outsider. So that's the ethical bit there. Then finally, there is the religious basis. And I link back to the point that I just made about kenosis, so that idea of you emptying yourself of your riches to be at one with the poor. And there is, for Gutierrez, the key idea behind liberation theology is that Jesus is the role model. And Gutierrez identifies that in the past there was a tendency for the church to see that poverty was in some way a virtue, and to refer to stories like the rich man and Lazarus, where Lazarus, leads a really poor life, but don't worry, he's going to go to heaven. And then to sort of identify or link spiritual poverty with spiritual growth with poverty, and the idea, we're doing people a favour by allowing them to be poor because it's a virtue. That's a key word there. And Gutierrez says that's just a self-serving model for the rich, so they can justify enabling poverty. And he says Jesus does not excuse poverty at all. He doesn't justify it. And if you look at the Old Testament, there is a history of of leaders liberating people. So whether it is Moses liberating the Hebrews, or you could talk about the Old Testament prophets and their ethical issues and support for the poor. And Gutierrez then points out that in addition, Jesus criticises the authorities when they don't do what they need to do to help the poor. So whether that is the story of the Good Samaritan, or when Jesus is attacking corruption when he throws the money changers out of the temple. And Gutierrez says that Jesus had a difficult relationship with the authorities of the time, whether they were the Jewish authorities or the Roman authorities. Jesus may have had links with the Zealots who were trying to overthrow the Romans, and that's ultimately what led to Jesus' death. And so in a similar fashion, Christians should take on authority. They should not be passive, they should rebel and fight for justice. That is as much a religious issue as it is an ethical issue. And then because the prophets have got such a focus on justice and liberating the poor, I've chosen a quote from my favourite prophet, Amos, that says, "Let justice flow like a river." And then we've returned to another key term for Gutierrez, which is preferential treatment for the poor. And so if you are going to follow the example of Jesus, you are going to give preferential treatment to the poor. And so the church needs to ask itself, how can we help the poor? How can we help them first? So to remind you, have a paragraph on each aspect of the question. So in this case, religious basis of liberation theology, ethical basis, and political basis. Remember your passages to back up your point, and keep focusing on the scholar at hand.